Ever heard of an epidemic of penile amputations?
Oh, wow.
Yeah, get ready to dive into a truly unique chapter of medical history. Our source. A 1983 article from the American Journal of Surgery titled Surgical Management of an Epidemic of Penile Amputations in Siam.
And before you ask, Siam is the former name of Thailand. This article isn't just a dry medical report. It paints a picture of 1970s Thailand, a society grappling with infidelity, revenge, and some seriously skilled surgeons.
Okay, let's unpack this. The article keeps mentioning this phrase, chai yen, almost like it's a key to understanding what was going on.
Cheyenne is all about keeping your cool, especially when faced with anger or conflict. It was a deeply ingrained social value in Thailand. Think of it as the art of staying calm, composed even in the face of adversity.
Which makes the whole amputation thing even more surprising, right?
Yeah.
This wasn't some outburst of uncontrolled rage.
Precisely. The article suggests that for many wives in the 1970s dealing with unfaithful husbands, this concept of chai yen reached a breaking point.
And their response was, well, about as far from keeping a cool heart as you can get.
It's a rather jarring contrast. What's more, these acts were often very public. The article describes how traditional Thai homes back then were often built on stilts with open spaces underneath.
Wait a minute. Are we talking what I think we're talking about? Out the window, so to speak.
Often, yes. And to make matters even more unsettling, it wasn't uncommon to keep ducks under the house.
Oh, no. Please tell me there isn't a saying about ducks and...
There is. The article quotes a popular saying from that time. I better get home or the ducks will have something to eat. It speaks to a darkly humorous, almost knowing acceptance of these events within certain segments of society.
That's a lot to unpack.
Yeah.
So it's not just that these events were happening, but there was a level of societal awareness, even acceptance surrounding them.
The article highlights a degree of media support for these actions, even from prominent women. Now, this doesn't mean everyone condoned what was happening, but it does point to a different set of social dynamics and attitudes than what we might be accustomed to today.
It really makes you think about how we interpret history and the danger of applying our own modern sensibilities to a different time and place.
Absolutely. What we have here is a snapshot of a specific moment in Thai history, seen through the lens of a medical journal.
And speaking of the medical side, let's talk about the surgeons who found themselves dealing with, well, I can't imagine this was your everyday surgical emergency.
It certainly wasn't. They were facing an influx of a very specific type of injury, and according to the article, they were initially caught off guard.
So we've got this surge in a very specific injury. What happens next? Do the surgeons have a playbook for this kind of thing?
Not exactly. The article describes how the surgeons at Siraj Hospital in Bangkok, found themselves on the front lines of this unusual epidemic. Back then, they didn't have all the fancy microsurgery techniques we have today.
Okay, so what do? Give up?
Not a chance. They got inventive. Necessity, as they say, is the mother of invention. They developed their own unique method for reattachment, a simple approach, but surprisingly effective given the circumstances.
Talk about resourceful. So walk us through it. What did this new procedure actually look like?
Well, imagine this. The article describes amputated penises arriving at the hospital in all sorts of conditions, wrapped in handkerchiefs, newspapers. One was even delivered in a banana leaf.
A banana leaf. That seems optimistic.
It does, doesn't it? Sometimes they'd arrive packed in ice, sometimes just in a basic plastic bag. Regardless, the surgeons had to work quickly. Each organ had to be carefully cleaned and prepped for surgery.
I bet. So once they were prepped, what did the actual surgery involve?
The key here was speed and precision. The surgeons would start by prepping the patient, cleaning the wound site, and then meticulously reattaching the severed penis. They'd reconnect the urethra, blood vessels, and nerves using incredibly fine sutures. Keep in mind, this was before the days of advanced microsurgical equipment, so their success is even more remarkable.
That's incredible. So despite using a less technologically advanced approach, they were able to successfully reattach these. Well,
For the most part, yes. The article highlights the surprising resilience of the amputated organ, even after hours in less than ideal conditions.
And this is where I find the article really fascinating. It's not just about the surgical procedure. It dives into the individual stories, right?
It does. And each case study provides a glimpse into the human side of these events. We see the fear, the desperation, and sometimes even a glimmer of hope.
Like the 35-year-old man whose penis was brought to the hospital in a plastic bag. It's almost hard to believe.
It does sound like something out of a movie, doesn't it? Then there's the case of the man who had his penis retrieved from a septic tank.
Wait, seriously?
Apparently after being flushed down the toilet. The article mentions this happened in a few instances, and you know what's even more surprising? In many of these cases, they were still able to reattach it.
You've got to be kidding me. Not only did they fish it out of a septic tank, but they managed to reattach it. That's just,
Right.
wow, talk about dedication. But these cases also bring up an important point. It wasn't always wives attacking husbands, was it?
You're right. While that seems to be the dominant narrative, the article does mention cases of self-inflicted amputations and even a few with unclear circumstances.
So we've covered the why behind these amputations, the ingenuity of the surgeons, and even some specific cases. But what about the aftermath? What were the long-term outcomes for these patients?
That's what we'll delve into next. This is where the article gets really insightful.
So we've talked about the surgeries themselves, but what happened after these men left the hospital? Did they regain normal function?
The article actually goes into surprising detail about this. It says that most patients regained urinary function, which is remarkable considering the trauma their bodies went through.
That's a huge relief, I imagine. But what about, other functions?
That was where things got more complicated. The article says that tactile sensation, the ability to feel, was often lost even after extended healing periods.
Wow. That must have been incredibly difficult for these men to process, both physically and emotionally.
Absolutely. And while the article doesn't go too deep into the psychological impact, it does hint at a range of responses. Some patients struggled to cope, while others, surprisingly, found a silver lining.
The silver lining in this situation. I'm almost afraid to ask.
Believe it or not, some patients reported that the lack of sensation actually allowed for longer intimacy.
Well, that's certainly an unexpected outcome. It just goes to show that human experiences, even in the face of trauma, are incredibly diverse and complex.
Exactly. And this complexity is something to keep in mind as we reflect on this whole phenomenon.
It really makes you think. We've covered the medical marvels, the surprising outcomes, but I think it's important to acknowledge the larger issue here.
You're right. It's impossible to ignore the fact that we're dealing with a pattern of extreme reactions to infidelity, a complex interplay of cultural norms, and the very human emotions of betrayal and revenge.
It's a lot to process, honestly. This deep dive has been a wild ride. Medical ingenuity, cultural insights, and some seriously thought-provoking ethical questions.
It certainly challenges our assumptions and reminds us that history is rarely black and white.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into a truly unique moment in medical history, I'm left wondering, what can we learn from all of this? What happens when a society's values, like the emphasis on Chai Yen, are pushed to their limits?
It's a question worth pondering, and perhaps it's a reminder that even in the pursuit of keeping a cool heart, there are boundaries, lines that, when crossed, can lead to unexpected and often irreversible consequences.
Something to think about. And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder the intricacies of this fascinating, if unsettling, chapter in history. Until next time, keep those minds curious and those conversations flowing.